Hey everyone, welcome back to another video of the series where we are building a real-time chat application using Laravel Reverb. In the previous episode, we created a simple database schema, created the coding migrations and the models. We also then set up our relationships on the models, and then we said in this video we would be looking at creating the factories and seeds and testing out if our setup works. But we have to do something in between, because when I finished up the video last week, I realized I made a mistake, and I will just walk you through what I figured out, and then we will just fix this together in this video. And then if we have enough time, we will also look at creating the factories and seeds as we need them. So let's jump back to the small diagram that I created. It's not really a database UML, but it was meant to showcase what we have. We said we're gonna have users, obviously, and they will have conversation with each other, and then these conversations will contain messages where there is a sender and there is a receiver. So can you see the mistake here, or the issue? We said we will have users that talk to each other, but then we ended up creating a users table here, a conversations table, and then we connected it with a conversation user table. But that basically means that one single user will have a lot of conversations, but then a lot of conversations, like a conversation can have a lot of users, which doesn't really make sense, right? Because we want to have two users to belong to one conversation. Otherwise it would be like a group chat, but that's not what we want. So let's fix this. How do we do that? Basically, what we don't want to have is this thing here, but instead we want to have a user basically having a conversation with another user. So our relationship is actually user to user, and then this conversation model is not really a model, it's the intermediate table. That also makes sense because if we look back at our code from last time, we will notice that when we created the migration, this was just empty. So going back to our diagram, what we actually want to have is something like this, but then maybe this needs to point in both directions, and then basically another user will have the same thing. So we have a conversation that will have two users, but the relationship between users and users, it's the intermediate table that is the conversations itself. But then also, to be clear, which makes it a bit more complicated and which might be the reason why I missed this last time, the intermediate table will then have a has money relation to messages. So let's go back to our migrations. We have our conversations table already here, but then we also have this thing that we don't need anymore. What I will do is I will copy over these two because they are still relevant over to our conversations table, and then import this, and then I can basically delete this one here. So let me remove this, and now what we need to do here is go to our conversations model, and instead of making this a model, what we want to do is we want to change it to a pivot. This basically says that conversation itself is not a the conversation itself is not a model itself, but it's a pivot table. A pivot table meaning it's the intermediate table. And then once we've done that, the other thing we need to change is these are not belong to manys anymore, but they are just simple belong tos, because basically user A only points to one single user, same with user B. And that also means we need to rename this to foreign key. There we go. So now we have set up our pivot table, but we now also need to make sure that in our users model, we basically make use of that pivot. Right now, this is set up as it was a many to many relationship, but what we have here is conversations. This belongs to, as we said here, like a user belongs to another user. Basically, we have a many to many relationships between the users. And so what we want to do here is change this to user. But what we need to make sure is, like, we have to make sure that this is, let's use the name properties here. This is all related, and our table is going to be the conversations table, which is like, which we need to mention explicitly because we don't follow the naming conventions anymore. We won't have a user_user table here. And then for the foreign pivot key, we are going to use, what are we going to use here? We will be using user A, and for the related pivot key, we will be using user B. And this means this user is connected with user A from our conversations table, and then the other user, basically this user, is going to be connected via user B. So this is our first step, and let's put this into a separate line. But then what we also want to do is let's rename this pivot table to conversations, or conversation, as it's one singular conversation between these two users. And we also want to make sure that this is using its own model, conversation. This is basically now the model that we marked as a pivot table in here. So we've got this, and we've got this, and now we've also made sure that this pivot table has this has money relationship, which still works as before. And then there's basically not a lot to do. This should be our setup. So if we now go over and want to try this out, what we're going to do here is we have to look at our seeders and factories. So let's start with what a factory is. A factory is basically a layer or a concept in Laravel that's attached to a model, and it gives us the opportunity to make sure that for when we basically want to create or quickly create a model instance, we don't always have to provide like values. We can use a factory to define default values, and even like this is the default value definition, but we also have a way to like override them based on states. And for the definitions, we are using, as you can see, like fakes, so that when we create multiple instances, we literally get random values rather than the same value over and over again. And then on top of that, when we use this together with database seeders, we can then make sure that when we run a seeder, which is a command line, like a command line action, we will basically insert fake values into the database. This is what we're going to do. So by calling the factory and then calling create, this will basically insert a user. And as you can see, we've only defined the name and the email address here, and everything else will be filled in with random values. So for our scenario, like maybe we can delete this, but we can see we can even provide a number. This would, for example, create 10 users. But in our scenario, we have user A, right? And we want to create, let's also name this guy John Doe, and this is John. And then we also have user B, and this is Jane. And now how do we create a relationship? We will do that by saying user A conversations, which will basically be a relationship between two users. So we will say save user B. And this basically creates a conversation between two users. We can test that out by refreshing our database and seeding it straight away with the values. And it's complaining, not such table as conversation. And that's happening because in users we called this conversations, but it needs to be conversations. Let's run this again, and it worked. And now if we open Artisan Tinker, we can just play around. For example, we can basically go ahead and let's for example look at the first user first. So this is going to get us John Doe. This is basically a user model, but now what we want to do is we want to have the conversations, and you will see we've got a belongs to many. What did I do here? Oh yeah, what I have to do here is also with pivot and then user A, user B. Is that what I'm missing here? No. Is this possibly that I have to do has many here? No, this can't be it. So why is this not giving me what I'm looking for? Oh, actually, it is. Right, I just need to, there you go. So what I should have done is I should have called conversations directly, and this is going to give me a collection. So let me undo. No, I don't need to undo anything here. But what we've shown is conversations is returning us a collection of users basically. So one weird thing is this is actually not a collection of conversations. It's more a list of users that my current user has a conversation with. So what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to rename this to inbox, because I think that represents this setup better. So let's have a look. I have to restart this. But if I now say inbox, and then I say first, I will get the first item or the first conversation in the inbox, and that's with user 2, Jane Doe, as we've set up. And then from here, I can go ahead and say, give me the conversations and conversation, and this will give me the conversation I like intermediate table. And now that this is a conversation table, I can also go ahead and say messages, and this is giving me an empty collection, which is correct because right now we didn't store any messages. So what we're going to do is, let's create a factory called messages factory, or is it message? I think it's messages factory. Let's see. And then in here has factory. So what we will do here is, what does our database migration look like? We need to add a table foreign ID for user calling sender ID, and we will also have something like string, or actually text, for message, or let's say text because we might have attachments or something later on. So we've got the text here, and then in our message factory what we are going to do is fill up these values. So we've got sender ID, we've got text, and we will have a conversation ID. So let's do sender ID first. Sender ID will be a user, so we will say user factory create one if you didn't pass one, and use that ID. And for text we will just say use the fake and give me maybe a sentence, and there we go. We can even define how long, so let's say a sentence with 10 words. And if we now go to the user, I think we also need to change this to inbox because we renamed this. And what we're going to do is we will create a message factory create, and then the conversation ID will be conversation ID will be this user's inbox, where user B is user B dot ID, and then we get the conversation. We need to get this, and then the conversation, and then the ID. Let's see if this is working by running our migration. And it's not, because it needs to be called message factory, so singular. Let's fix this quickly. There you go. Let's run this again. And property conversation does not exist on a collection. And that's because conversation is a collection. There we go. And oh, it's not this. This needs to be first. And then this should be working. Table messages has no column called conversation ID. And why is this? Did we not add one here? We did. So conversation ID, do we have a typo in our factory? No. So what did we miss? Table messages has no column named conversation ID. Did I run the migrations? Yes. And it is still complaining. So let's have a look. What am I missing here? We have a database table. Let me make this just foreign ID, and then let me manually name this conversation ID. Is this working? All right, so it is potentially complaining that I didn't pass something in this factory. So that's where things will get a bit more complicated, but let's try this. So we need to add something here to get this working, and we need to figure out how we are going to do this. So we only get a conversation ID if our factory also has a user. So we need to basically create something like this. But inside our factory. So we don't need this message, but we need a user A and user B so that we have our conversation. And then the conversation ID will be what we set here. And we will have to add this in here. Let's see if this works. No, because we also need to make sure that these users are fake users with a unique email. So let's do this. They don't get any names. But this is still failing. So what I will do is I will pause this for now and figure this out and come back into the next video. And I think that's probably the easiest one for me here. Otherwise, I will just try out things on the go, and that might take just ages. Or what I can do is, that's probably easier because I don't want to finish on a incomplete thing. I'll just figure this out myself, and then I will come back to this video once I'm done. So yeah, I'm back, but I still have no resolution. For some reason, it looks like that Laravel, or the setup I have, expects a user A on the messages table, but like, look at this. Select star from messages where user A is null and user A is not null. It's not even possible. Like, I have no idea where my setup fails here, but what I will do is I will give it a go through this and try to sort it out. Then in the next video I'm going to explain what's broken. So until then, see you, bye bye.